Thanks everyone for coming. We have people here from over 20 countries that are listening in. I apologize for people in places where you're up in the middle of the night, but thank you for coming anyway. We have people from the Ukraine, from Canada, Singapore, Denmark, Korea, Chile, Luxembourg. It's just going to be a fantastic webinar. As I said, my name is Pam Cooley, and I'm the Executive Director of the CSA. We are a worldwide association focused on the growth and the health of the car share industry and our ecosystem. And while people are still coming on, I have a few things to say about the association. We are building momentum and our association, not just in members, but in our engagement with you and others around the world. And I have three projects that we're doing to engage you all and others. We have one, it's a webinar series this is the first one, and that are going to be open to anyone worldwide. And at some point we will cut it off for just members, but this is a way for people to understand and know the association a little bit better and to know the caliber of work that we do. And so this is one way that we're trying to make sure that people know about us and want to learn more about us. The second project is it's called a mapping project. And if you haven't, it's an ongoing project. And if you haven't already seen it, it's a visual car sharing map for around the world. And it's on our website, and please let me know if you it's exciting to see yourself on the map, and if you are on the map, that's great. If it's inaccurate, let me know if something's inaccurate. If it's accurate and you know people that are not on it, please oh, okay, what happened there? Please let me know and I'll get that fixed. So it's an ongoing project, so I want you to just go to carsharing.org and take a look at the map and see if you're on it and give us feedback. A big shout out to the folks at Move Me based in Vancouver for their part in the work that they did. It's the third thing is a conference, and we hold a conference every year and a half, and many of you have been to our conferences, and many of you went to our conference in Paris last year. The next conference will be in May of 2020, so watch for the date and make sure that you create a budget line in there for your participation, both as participants as well as sponsors. And speaking of sponsors, I'm happy to announce that this first webinar is being sponsored by Inverse. And we want to thank them very much for being our first sponsor. Inverse has been in the shared mobility space. Oops. Trying to mute all of you. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm having some problems with my screen. Okay. So thank you to Inverse for being our sponsor. They've been in the shared mobility space since the beginning, with its founder inventing the first car sharing technology in 1993. The founder was in need to get access to a vehicle with owning one. And why? Because he often needed to run errands or visit his girlfriend, and yet it wasn't worth buying a car. So since then, Inverse has been working hard behind the scenes and has excelled to make car sharing operators successful, from enterprise car share in the US and UK to Drivy by Get Around in many European countries. So thank you to Inverse for being there for us. So a few words about what this hour is going to be. We're going to it's really simple. I'm going to pass it off to Tim Papandreou, who will be our first speaker in this series. And he will do his presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A. And some people have already written in their questions, and we'll take time for some in the chat as well. So for those of you who don't know Tim, he's a very wonderful, fast speaker, and we want to get as much as possible in the video. So we can also, I'm recording it so we can see it later. and it'll be available online on our website. So you'll be able to go back to it and watch it over again and share it with your colleagues and politicians or whoever is discussing these issues with you. So now I'm going to introduce Tim. I have the pleasure of knowing Tim for a number of years now, and I can't think of a better person I would like to have as our first guest speaker for our webinars. Tim is currently living in San Francisco, and his bio is a mile long, and his experience relevant to mobility is also a mile long, pun intended. He knows the policy world. He knows how to transform cities from being the chief and innovator from San Fran's Municipal Transport Agency. He's worked for Google, self-driving cars, and Waymo, and then specifically shared mobility. He's an expert that I love to rely on. What I like about Tim is he doesn't hold back to say what he thinks people need to hear. And in my opinion, this is a rare and valuable friend.
Morning.
Hi. Everybody's muted right now, so I don't know why it continues to not be muted. There we go. I won't go into his bio, but because it's online, but I will say he's a good friend for doing this for us. So thank you very much, Tim. I'm trying to mute everybody, and it keeps on popping out. So please mute yourself. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Papandreou. Hold on. Tim, did you get the?
Yep.
That's awesome. Okay, everyone.
Code followed by the pound or hash sign.
I don't know why my all mute. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're all muted except for you, Tim. I have to unmute you. Hold on. Unmute Timothy. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you, Tim.
Okay.
Off we go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Pam and the Carsharing Association and Inverse for inviting me to kick off this webinar series. As Pam mentioned, I have worked almost 2 decades on different forms of transportation. If it moves, I've basically launched it, worked around it, helped it, enabled it, or tried to regulate it. So something like that is definitely within my wheelhouse. I have not worked on, the only thing I haven't worked on is space shuttles, and my uncles work at NASA and they take care of that. So we pretty much got this world covered. I'm going to spend this time now just going over some of the key transportation trends and some of the outlook that I've been doing with my company now, which is, I've been in there for about 6 months now with Emerging Transport Advisors. And what we do is we work with mainly with investment banks, long-term pension funds, governments, and mobility companies to help them navigate this world of this next decade or so of transition, because there's a lot of talk and frankly a lot of hype going on, and there's very little substance. And so I've been trying to help these different groups kind of get the sense of what's happening in the world and help them navigate a path towards viability and improving on their business model or their policy or their framework. So with that, I'll move us forward. These are all my contact details, email address. You can follow me on Twitter. You can retweet what I'm saying. I'm okay with that. As Pam said, I don't hold back, so we're gonna go forward. So when we look at mobility itself, we cannot hide the fact that mobility is an outcome of our land use, and our transportation system is a response to our land use. And as we're growing in population around the world, we're starting to become more urbanized. If we expect in the next 25 to 30 years to basically move the equivalent of 3 billion people into cities, most of them which exist and only a few will be created, then the idea that we can move them around in the current transport systems we have, no matter where you are in the world, by their own personal car, is just not going to be physically possible. It just comes down to basic geometry and physics, and it just doesn't work. So we have to figure out ways to shift behavior, avoid the growth of personal car ownership, while ensuring that the regional economies actually sustain themselves and can actually transition towards a more just, sustainable, and equitable economy. These are all the big key words that everybody says, but the challenge is, how do you actually do all this stuff? And we've got some really big issues that we need to confront as a transportation system, whether you are the regulator, the operator, the provider, or the funder of the system. We all have done some things that have not helped us to get in the ideal position. And so what happens is, we've had 7 decades of really, really targeted psychological marketing that basically says that if you buy this car, you will be a better person, you'll be a more affluent person, you'll have a higher status, you're going to do all the things that you can't do right now. And it's always on this beautiful road, on a beautiful scenic highway, because that's the image that gets you to say yes. And I am in charge of a lot of meetings where people pitch stuff to us. And if I said to you, here is a product that gets used 5% of the time, it costs $35,000 on average, and you utilize it for about 20% of its occupancy, and it's going to depreciate the second it walks out of the building, and there's no real understanding of what the return on investment is. And by the way, going to create a lot of other impacts to the economy. No one's going to rush in and put their hand up and say, yeah, I'll buy this. But because we turn it around and say, this is actually what you can achieve by having this purchase, you say yes. So for the last 7 or 8 decades, we've kind of divorced basic rational economics out of our transport system, and the results have been pretty catastrophic. This is a result. So you basically say, okay, I wanted that vehicle, but then everybody says they wanted that vehicle and that wanted experience, and this is what they end up with. And this is a supply problem to not understanding demand. And so engineers, planners, transportation agencies basically do predict and provide analysis, and they basically respond and say, well, lots of people are driving, it's quote unquote congested, we need to add more capacity because that's what moves things through. That's like saying, I have a weight problem, and the only way to manage my weight problem is to actually loosen my belt on my pants so I can eat more food. That's just not how this works. You actually need to go on some sort of demand management diet to make this actually work. And it's not the engineer's fault either. They're pretty much given some very clear parameters of what they can work with, but no one talks about pricing the road system, managing demand through other means. It's the equivalent of having your house on fire and no one's allowed to talk about water. That's just not the ideal. And we've kind of put ourselves into this straitjacket policy. And this is what happens when we over-design for one technology, when we invest all of our resources into one technology. We have to change our world around us. And some people call this terraforming, and that's what we've done around the whole planet. This is Detroit on the left-hand side in the 1930s. Those black circles are trees. This place was very, very heavily treed. On the right-hand side is Detroit in the 1970s, and more than a third of that land's been demolished basically to make way for single occupant private car passenger use. So, and unfortunately, this story is being repeated all over the world. And even if you're in a developing nation right now, most of your policies right now in 2019 are perpetuating this myth that we can actually build our way out of this problem. And the answer is we cannot. So we need to have a bit of a reality check about what we can and cannot do moving forward. And there's some real consequences to this one investment in one technology. 3/4 of our global air pollution in our urban areas is because of people driving cars. 1.2 million people are killed every year because people are not paying attention in their cars. And that's the equivalent of a 747 plane falling out of the sky pretty much every day. After about 3 days, we would shut down the aviation system. But for some reason, we've agreed that this is the cost of doing business in transport, and it's a real problem. On average, people spend about 10 days of their lives every year in a car. That's 10 days. In the US and in Japan, that's pretty much all you get for vacation. So you realize how much loss of productivity we have by people actually in cars, spending that time really doing nothing other than driving. And then about 15 to 20% of the adult working population cannot sustain a full-time job because they don't have access to a car. And that is a real challenge, because when we're talking about ladders of opportunity and improving intergenerational access to equity, that's a big deal. If you design your technology around one transportation system, around one technology, those who can't access that technology are literally left out of economic opportunities. So there's some, not just economic imperatives here, there's some equity and moral imperatives as well. And what happens is that when we have one technology with one kind of work practice, we have these peaks. This is called a cat's ear diagram. Those two cat's ears, the 2 points, are the morning peak and the evening peak. And those two peaks are caused by everybody having to go to work in a car. And the interesting thing is that in 2019, half of those people that need to go to work by car don't actually have to go to work anymore. They don't have to go to the workplace. They can work from home because they have internet access. So this isn't even a transportation issue. This is a work culture issue. Your boss needs you to come to work and sit on that desk so he feels or she feels that you're actually working. Where in fact, you could be at home even 1 or 2 days a week, or even an afternoon a couple of times a week, and we could have a dramatic reduction in congestion. So cars are not the cause of congestion. It's our workplace rules and our current cultural society that's actually the cause of congestion. So when you hear people say we need to do this and this and this to remove congestion, it's just really not true. It's on some light public holidays where most people don't go on the public holiday, the freeway system moves at free flow. And that's an interesting indicator that we don't need to change behavior for 50, 80% of the population. It's maybe 5 or 10%. And this is the beauty of how things like new mobility opportunities can really help just shave those tips of those ears off so that the system moves and we can have traffic flow. What's interesting is that over the last decade, we've started to see signs and signals that the transport system is changing. It's no longer going to be just about private car ownership or even fixed route public transport, but more of a menu of different choices that kind of fit based on your different mobility needs in the different times of your life and how they also interact and interconnect with each other. So over this next decade, we're going to start seeing a sunsetting of that traditional model and a sunrise of this more integrated and multimodal type approach. But it's going to be different in different places. This won't happen everywhere all at once, and it won't happen in all locations. And yes, there will be an urban-rural issue, and we're going to have to deal with that. But understand that this is where we're seeing the signals popping up to show that there are people, and there are companies, and there are governments that are interested in doing something different and actually starting to turn the tide on that never-ending stream of growing car ownership. So these 3 mega trends are what's really pushing this transformation. The first is this trend of sharing, whether it's shared fleets, shared rides, or shared services. The idea that you will no longer just own your own vehicle, or you won't have multiple vehicles owned in your house, that's becoming more of a reality, and it's happening all over the world in various cities, in various locations. The key challenge with the sharing piece is that we're seeing more and more people have a rise in income and choosing not to share because personal private space is becoming more and more of a premium. So the idea that you can actually share rides versus share fleets still is a good indicator that things are moving in the right direction, but it's on its own, it won't be enough to move the needle into those big changes we want to see happen. Electrification is the same thing. We're seeing an incredible investment in electrified transport, not just private car, but also public transport and off-road vehicles, but they're moving at their own pace based on battery technology, electric vehicle charging opportunities, and a few other things that are happening in that space. The price is getting closer to parity, and there's a few other pieces where it's going to make sense. But again, electrification on its own is not going to do anything to help really move the needle other than help on local air quality, which is a tremendous shift, but it's still not enough on its own. And then we have automated technology. So really important to call it automated technology and not automated vehicles, because it's actually not tied to any vehicle. It's a technology that can be applied to any any form factor, as long as it's moving in a direction. And it's interesting thing with automation is that it's getting a lot of press lately, but it's actually a technology that it's going to go through a very deliberate process of iteration and innovation, and it's going to be very step by step by step. So I've worked on this for a couple of years in the team at Google X and at Waymo, and the team had been working on it for 9 years, and now they're at that point where we're starting to see applications becoming viable. But there's a lot of work still to be done. Again, on its own, it can do an incredible job of helping us finally deal with those traffic collisions and those crashes, because a lot of the collision avoidance technology can make a huge dent on saving people's lives. If that's all we did, there would be a huge shift in our transport system, but we know that's not enough. The combination of all these three things together is what can really make some sustained change in our transportation system, correct some of those age-old ills that are plaguing our system, course correct some of the incoherent and outdated and obsolete policies, and really start making roads into changing the way that we move around and that we actually develop and design our cities. But only and if these three things work in concert with a few other pieces that I'll talk about, will we actually see these effective changes. And we've seen this change on the shared side move really quickly in the last couple of years, but it took a long time to get there. You may be familiar with this graph. This is the growth of global car sharing worldwide. It's starting to now pivot into that J curve, that inflection point in 2012, really now starting to grow. And there's a lot of discussion around car sharing and how car sharing can actually be the gateway into behavioral change. And it can also be the litmus test for how cities can actually really start seeing people shift from car ownership into a car light or a multimodal behavior. It's rarely coming from other modes. It usually comes from car sharing first, because car sharing is the closest thing to car ownership that allows people to now start to question, how many of these trips do I really need to take in a car? And how many of these now are actually candidates for other modes of transportation? So it's an incredible inflection tool to really start helping people to think a little differently about their transportation system, while offering them the most important thing that car ownership does, which is that flexibility and that mobility insurance, that insurance that no matter what happens, I can always hop in a car if I have to and complete my trip, or if something happens at work, etc. during the day, I can complete my trip with the car if I need to. But as they become more and more adept at this system, if there are more offerings in their life, they can actually switch to other modes as well and create more of a complete multimodal experience. And what's interesting is that the technology companies are already getting their head around this and saying that if we can stitch together a multimodal offering that is as convenient, as simple, and as easy as just reaching for your keys, and by the way, a little cheaper and hopefully more fun, we're going to see a massive, massive shift globally of people wanting to use a multimodal system than just having to rely on a car, which can become more and more expensive and more inconvenient over time, especially if we're going to see a massive influx of people in cities, and we're going to have to become more vertical in our landform. Many consultants have explored this idea and said, well, if all this actually happened worldwide, we're talking about a $10 trillion economy by 2035. That's orders of magnitude more than what we have today. And the idea being that all of this will be tied to technology, whether it's your assistant, your calendar, your online platforms, your payment systems, etc. A digital profile of yourself becoming much more adept at responding to your daily needs and predicting what you're going to do next, and then offering that transport mode availability as you move forward. It's not a fantasy anymore. There's the building blocks that are starting to be put in place to make this a reality. And transport may actually become a background thing rather than a foreground thing. In other words, if you're and your friend wanting to go to a movie or go to a restaurant or a cafe, and you agree to accept their invitation, these aggregating companies that are going to put together the retail offer and the dinner offer and the movie offer are probably going to start sourcing transport options to make sure that it works for you based on the time location, and even the weather. It may be a nice day that day, and the offer is an electric bicycle or electric scooter because it's actually sunny outside and you want to be outside. So all of these preference-based systems are all starting to be developed right now as we speak. And the reason why the technology companies are trying to get into this space is because they've realized that, you know, cars are great for some things, but not really good for urban areas, especially for short trips. This is a profile of the United States, and 2/3 of car trips, not all trips, but 2/3 of car trips are less than 8 kilometers or 5 miles. I made it metric because most of this audience is probably metric. So what that means is that we're using a really expensive, heavy, large machine to do some very basic errands, and something that easily could be done by walking, a scooter, a bicycle, a moped, some sort of car sharing offer, or some sort of vehicle device that can be used in that space. And this is why these companies are starting to get investment in this area, because they can peel away market share from private car trips and replace them with these different modes. Now, on the longer distance trips, which is, you know, again, less than 1/3, this is where car sharing and other services, car rentals, etc., make a lot more sense. And then in the longer distance as well, so in the 40+ kilometer mark, that's what makes sense as well. But you see the number of trips drops precipitously. So while we talk a lot about these longer trips, longer commutes, the bulk of our car trips are the really short trips. And this is where form factor and space is going to become much more relevant and important as these shared mobility options flourish. So let's just get a little work on automation, because there's a lot of talk on automation. It's very, very confusing. So automation is going to come in 3 flavors: passenger automation, delivery automation or logistics, and tasks. Tasks are things like construction, mining, agriculture, all the things that you don't see and don't care about, but are sure glad you can access whenever you can because you like the things to be available at your doorstep. So those are the 3 core areas. The one on the right is actually fairly in progress, and there's a lot of work to be done, but it's actually quite straightforward. The middle one is where there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of work being tested out right now. And the level of complexity is much harder than the tasks area. But the one on the left, moving people, I can tell you from firsthand, is really, really hard. And it's going to take a lot of work to get it going. The reason being is that a box or a agricultural machine doesn't really care how it gets from A to B as long as it gets there. But a person really cares. If you in your world know the ride experience, the wait experience, the route experience, the booking and payment experience, the actual travel experience, all those things are really important. And so we've got a little bit more work to do on getting that ready for automated vehicle technology. The interesting thing is there's a lot of use cases that automated technology that's both shared and electric will offer in the interim and also in the long term. In the interim, a lot of what you've done in car sharing as well, first last mile access, getting to and from places that are not well served by public transport, closing out certain locations. These are definitely areas that will make a lot of sense until the technology can be fully automated. Because one thing's for sure is that it's not an issue about automated vehicles and public transport or cars or bikes. It's going to be the difference between an automated vehicle and a non-automated vehicle. And every vehicle eventually, no matter where it is in the world, will eventually become automated, because that's where the trajectory is heading for this space. There's just it's on its own pattern right now. It may not happen tomorrow or the next day, but over the next decade, we're going to see more and more situations where use cases will be able to be fulfilled in this space. And what this looks like is an interesting situation. So you may have heard of geofences. These are digital fences that we put around to create a service area, whether it's for a scooter or for an electric bike share or electric moped share, or even some of the ride-hailing services, they initially had geofenced areas. These situations are going to help us understand what kind of use cases can be fulfilled by shared mobility inside this geofence. And eventually, it'll be fulfilled by automated vehicle technology as well. The situation inside that geofence will be determined based on the characteristics of the land, the demographics, and the trip generators in that space. But outside the geofence will still be traditional transport options required to fulfill those trips. So car sharing, in my opinion, will always be necessary as part of this transition and then beyond, because most of those opportunities that car sharing can do really well right now will be outside the geofences for the time being and for the foreseeable future. And some of the fulfillment trips inside the geofence will be fulfilled by an automated vehicle. It may be shared, it may be a shared ride, it may actually be a shared fleet. So there are all these different opportunities inside that system. One thing for sure is that car sharing will be the gateway towards a lot of these services, whether they are manually operated or automated, or whether they're actually cars at all. That is to be determined. And there's nothing stopping any of you as car share operators to becoming vehicle share operators, because if you have car share, if you have cars or some sort of form factor that looks like a car or a scooter or a bike or a moped, it doesn't really matter as long as the customer can share those services, and the more they're bundled together, the more likely they're going to be wanting to use those services over their own private car. So these are kind of some of the opportunities that lay ahead. As we look at all this though, we have some pretty big issues that we need to deal with. And for the cities and the local governments and the regional governments that are listening in, you have a lot of work ahead of you to get this right. And luckily, there's a lot of examples out there worldwide where these best practices have been working really well. But the idea of the governance around this shift is going to be absolutely critical, and it needs to be developed over the next few years, because as these services start coming online, they're going to be pressing all the buttons that you haven't dealt with because you A, didn't have the wherewithal, B, weren't brave enough to deal with them, or C, just completely were blindsided by them. So we've had some experience in the last 5 years where just sitting around and playing victim is not good enough. You need to become much more assertive, put your feet forward, and start becoming much more proactive on how you want your city to look like in the next 10 years, and what are the governance guardrails you're willing to put in place so that you can manage this in a much more cohesive and effective way. There's 3 core areas where governance really needs to have some more work on. One is on the digital, which is all about the data. How do we manage data? How do we share data? How do you store data? All those questions really need to be answered, and answered fairly quickly. How do you manage all these mobility providers? You're no longer the only transport option provider. You're going to have multiple providers who are privately funded, sometimes with venture capital. Sometimes basic economics will not apply to them, so they can do crazy things that you normally wouldn't think of sustainable. But the question is going to be, can they be sustained, and can they be fulfilled? And will they meet the needs of all your residents and workers and visitors, or just an elite few? Those are some of the questions that you're going to be grappling with as you manage these providers. And the third area is really the infrastructure. This is where you do things that you know of really well. This is your bailiwick and your bread and your butter, right? You know infrastructure really well. But how are you going to allocate the space in the street? If we're going to be keep adding more and more people and growing vertically, there really is not much more room to add more capacity. So managing the capacity is going to be very important, and understanding how to manage that capacity is going to be just as important as understanding how to manage these providers. So I have these 5 guardrails that in the tech world, we call these kind of guardrails, but these really are your lines in the sand if you think about it. Good governance really has to have some very clear and consistent programs around what it considers deal breakers. So regardless of the technology, regardless of the application, regardless of the service, if it doesn't meet some core fundamental criteria, there's really no way that you can say with a straight face that you're actually looking out for your residents, workers, and visitors in your region. And same thing as a mobility operator. If you're not willing to work with these government agencies and to commit to at least some core basic areas, then you're not being very genuine as a mobility provider in the city. So safety is number one. Whatever you do, it has to be a safe, operable system. It has to be equitable. It has to be available for as many people as possible. Maybe not initially, but there needs to be a plan and a roadmap to make sure it's available for everybody. This is where partnerships with government is going to be very important, because your business model may not work initially to serve everybody everywhere, but there are some areas of the cities usually that are left behind. And so if you can work together with government to help develop some sort of shared program, that means that you can have more access to people that really can't have access to services right now. It has to also be interoperable. It can't be one system only. There has to be a way that these things can connect with each other so that other industries can be spawned from this and create more of a marketplace so we can see more and different services being offered. Competition is really important, and government up until recently has not really understood what competition is about. So having competition with some guardrails will be very, very important. You don't want a monopoly or a duopoly. You want to have a healthy ecosystem marketplace, because that's where innovation will thrive, and you'll be able to create all these differentiating use cases that will finally get access to people that can't use their services right now. What you don't want to do is repeat the same mistakes of one size fits all. You want to have something for everybody, but not the one thing for everyone, because that doesn't work, as we know. It has to be accessible as well, not just financially accessible, but also physically accessible. Universal access, so that people, regardless of their backgrounds and abilities, can at least benefit from these services, or at least have systems that they can benefit from. And it has to be sustainable, not just all of the eco-green stuff, but also noise and air pollution, etc. But also it has to be financially sustainable. You can't expect the city to continually, or the government to continually be funding and subsidizing something if it doesn't make sense for the rest of the system. Having said that, governments have to take a hard look now and say, what are we over subsidizing and what are we under subsidizing? And I can guarantee you the private car is over subsidized and the shared mobility systems are under subsidized. And we need to figure out ways to flip that switch. Otherwise, we're going to keep reporting the same problems we have now. And the challenge with the governance doesn't stop there. When you have a publicly managed transportation system now alongside a privately managed transportation system, you're going to have some questions about how these two things interconnect. So being very clear about your projects, your process, your outcomes, the performance criteria you want will help set a standardized approach for any new entrant to understand what their role is and how they can help you get to the outcomes that you want. But here is the challenge. So of all of that, it comes down to how we view our transport system. Right now, we spend a lot of time on these different modes of transport. They get a lot of press in the air, and we talk about them in different ways, sometimes deridingly, sometimes enthusiastically. But we're ignoring this entire area around us, which is private car usage, private car ownership. And too many governments right now are blinded by that, and they're focusing on that little thing in the corner that I've put in a red circle and saying it's their fault, it's their problem, they're the cause of all these issues, they're cluttering everything up. Excuse me, this little scooter that weighs 20 pounds is causing all your problems. You're ignoring the reality of everything else around you. Like, we need to do a bit of a reality check there and start realizing that our transport system as a whole works as one system, and anything we can do to manage that oversupply with better demand is really the core focus of this. And it's interesting is we have a tool, it's called car sharing. Car sharing is one of the only proven tools, and by car sharing I mean the traditional round trip car sharing model is one of the only proven tools that can actually change this situation. For every car share vehicle brought into the fleet, we start seeing a precipitous drop in car ownership over time. We see a reduction in people using cars, and we see an increase in people using other modes of transport. It does depend on the location, and it does depend on the area, but that is a quantifiable and tested and studied program. And if I was a city, this would be one of my first things that I'd focus on getting change behavior in our transportation system. When you add a fleet of car sharing vehicles, you start seeing a dramatic change. In cities that have added thousands of these vehicles, they're now talking in orders of tens of thousands of vehicles being retired. And so that starts making a huge dent in your overall transport system. And think of it this way, the more car share vehicles you add to your transport system, and the more they're strategically located, the better chance you have of actually shaving off some of those cat's ears that I was talking about. So there's some interesting opportunities there with the round trip car share system. Now, point to point is also very good. It's got some very good qualities. Many of the studies are still inconclusive on how much they can actually change car ownership. But the fact of the matter is, there's reasoned studies showing that the traditional car sharing services have tremendous value and actually do result in people reducing their car ownership. Now, as an ecosystem, if we grow this and scale it, we can start now really seeing a shift in demand in the transport system, while also seeing a reallocation opportunity for our space. So we can start seeing a much better use of our street space, so that it isn't all given away to private car use. It's actually given to people. Imagine that as a concept. We actually use our public space for the public, not for private car ownership and use. And to do that, we have to think about how we look at space in general. This is a diagram that we created when I was looking at this from a machine learning perspective for automated technology. Computers have no morals or values or any planning policy background. It's whatever you give them in terms of input. We actually allocated a space for a human and said each person needs about 1 square meter of space. And in that, we found that the best next mode of transport, other than walking, was a 2-wheeled or 3-wheeled device, bicycle, scooter, whatever it is, because the footprint is really small. And you can do a lot of trips on an electric bicycle, especially now, or even an electric cargo bicycle. When you look at it from a car perspective, that same person that takes up 1 tile needs 8 square meters of space. Doesn't matter if it's a personally owned car or a car share car or a ride-hailing car, it's a car. It needs a lot of space. So you need to use that vehicle wisely. It's not something that should just be like, you know, flaunted around the city. And for it to actually travel safely, it needs another 8 square meters of space around it. So now we need 16 times the space to move a person in a car than we do to move a person walking or in some sort of micromobility device. So space allocation is a real big issue in how we look at our streets in our future. We have to get more people in smaller footprints and not in these larger footprint vehicles. Or we have to put more people in these vehicles so that we can actually justify all of that excessive space that we're using. And how do we do that? We have to learn to read the streets in a different way. This is a typical street scenario that we see, and we're so numb to this that we think this is normal. This is a typical street. It's just how it is. We're just bought into it. But if we actually leave this as it is, if we go automated, even electric, nothing's going to change. It's going to be the same situation. But if we start reading the street differently and saying, well, hang on a second, look at the space each of these users takes up. So all those ones are people in cars, and it's backed up all the way 2 blocks down the road. To a traditional planner, this looks like congestion. And to an elected official, we've got to fix this congestion. So what should we do? We should widen this road. Well, you've got to break down buildings in cities to do that. And you're ignoring the 21 people on bicycles and the 100 people on public transport. And so when we really look at the street, we have to think about, well, what's the best use of our allocation of space, and how do we do that? Now, if we just allocate space based on that, we're going to see some shifts, but we also have to tap into the demand. And that's the beauty of shared mobility, whether it's car sharing or bike sharing or any of those other sharing services. They tap into the demand as well. So not only can you reallocate the space, you can actually manage the demand as your city grows. And so a better design of a street is just reallocating space based on usage. So people who are bicycling or scootering on micromobility, they need their own space, and they need to be much closer tied to the sidewalk than to the street. High occupancy lanes, whether it's for carpooling or for public transport, they also need their lanes, because if they can have frequency and verification of services and become more reliable, they can move a lot more people. And now all of a sudden, the allocation you have for private car use or for even for shared car use now becomes much more doable, and it can be allocated in a way that's much more fair and equitable, but also the system moves more effectively. This is actually very easy to do from an engineering perspective. Even from a cost perspective, it's a very light cost thing to do. Allocate space on paint, put in some bollards. It's politically very expensive. And this is where governance is going to be important, because without strong governance, without political leadership, a lot of this stuff can't move forward. So it's time for government staff to really step up and get that stomach of steel. By the way, I worked for a government for 10 years, so I have that stomach of steel. I know what it takes, and you've got to do what it takes to get there, because that's what moves the needle. And this is what it looks like. This is San Francisco. The busiest street in San Francisco was converted to green carpet for bike lanes, red carpet for transit and taxi occupancy. And then the rest of the space was allocated for private car use. And over time, we've started to slowly remove the private car use and actually create a space for shared multi-mobility. Public transit is the OG of shared mobility. Clearly, they get the lion's share of the space, but micromobility is starting to show a lot of opportunity and possibility as well. So between the micromobility vehicles and the small passenger vehicles and the large transit vehicles, these three services really offer much more throughput in a street than it did before. And the idea now that we would actually go back to make this not available is just not on the table, because there's so many more people moving through this corridor than there ever was. But also allocating space on the side streets for pickup and drop off, for car sharing, for bike sharing, etc. Those things are really important so that you can move people through the main corridors, but also create those pickup and drop off opportunities. So some more examples of how this looks, whether it's green or red only or green only, will be determined based on your city, whether it's these colors or not. It's not really the cause. The issue is the allocating street space so you can see that behavioral change happen quite quickly. But here's the thing. So for the public agencies in the audience, if this shared electric automated revolution happens, and it's planning to happen over this next decade or so, we have some real challenges with your finances, because car sales, gasoline sales and diesel sales, and parking revenue, fees and fines kind of fund most of the street allocation space that we have for our streets. And so many public agencies are realizing, what do we do when all of these sources of revenue dry up? How do we still maintain our transportation system? So we're going to have to think very differently from this point forward about where our revenue comes from and how we use that revenue moving forward. And the idea that we are moving away from taxes, fees, and fines to more of a pickup and drop-off fee is something that's starting to take traction in some place around the world. Here is the idea. It's a pickup and drop-off, better known as a PUDO in the tech space, where the price of the pickup and drop-off is determined on how long you're staying, what kind of vehicle type you have, and what kind of vehicle emissions, et cetera, noise, et cetera, that it takes in the footprint of the vehicle. So you can imagine a situation where the pickup and drop-off, maybe for a few seconds, it's in a micromobility vehicle. It may not have a fee. It may be so good for the area at that time, you actually may get a credit. You may be actually asked to walk instead and paid to walk. Imagine a scenario for all the bicyclists in the audience where you actually get paid to ride your bicycle once and for all. So we're trying to think of this as from a full cost accounting perspective. But those who need to get driven or drive or park the vehicle on the curb are going to pay a lot more than they're paying today, because you're using very precious public space that needs to be allocated in a way that's fair. And not just for passenger travel, but also for deliveries. The explosion of all of our e-commerce will mean that we're going to have to become much smarter in how we allocate space and how we charge for it, because between passenger and delivery curb space, that's basically the future of how we're going to move, let alone things coming from above, allocating the airspace above us as well. Some cities are exploring the idea of how do they actually start allocating space above the skies, and do we want 1,000 drones in peak hour delivering things for us on the sidewalk? And even more, do we want 1,000 urban aviation vehicles flying above us? Those who live in cities where you hear a lot of helicopters, imagine increasing that by 100 times. Do we want that? Like, these are big questions to ask, and what does that actually look like? But from a pure finance perspective, we need to think very differently in how we're going to actually fund our transport system. So one more thing that I want to share with is, there's been a lot of work done on how cities and governments and states can work better with car sharing providers to actually really leverage those incredible opportunities that really no other transport system can actually leverage at this time. And that is really through codifying car sharing in developments. There's many cities, and you can ping me after, and I can share examples of how many cities have actually codified car sharing in lieu of parking requirements in developments. That creates this virtuous cycle. You have a built-in demand of users in the building, whether it's for residential or commercial or anything else, and there's a steady supply of car share vehicles, which helps them with their business model. So codifying is really important. standardizing your request for proposals and your policy frameworks is going to be very helpful to help car sharing grow. If it's a one size fits all approach for the policy framework, that's a much more appealing approach for car sharing to thrive in your community. But if it's a bespoke city by city or neighborhood by neighborhood or department by department approach, that's very, very challenging. Also, one of the best ways that cities can show leadership in the movement towards car sharing being uptake is through their municipal fleets. Your municipal fleets, I used to work with them, are very expensive and have incredibly terrible utilization, even worse than private cars. So if there's a way to actually partner with a car sharing organization, they can actually provide the vehicles for you. They maintain them better than you can and operate them better than you can, but also they get utilized more, and you can actually offer them into the community outside work hours so that the community can use them as well. So there's a really nice synergy. There's also an opportunity there. You can test and play with electric vehicles, which up until recently been a challenge for car sharing, but in a municipal fleet, you have access to the car chargers, and that actually is a much better opportunity to get it going. The other area is on working with your transportation providers who provide services like apps to make sure that car sharing is actually in that mix. Many of these apps don't offer car sharing, so having them increasing visibility of car sharing increases uptake, and it's been proven in many use cases around the world. And the other area is allocating space for car shared vehicles to be near hubs, whether they are transit hubs or venues where there's a lot of shopping and retail. Wherever there's a lot of concentration of people, you should be able to allocate space for car sharing, because that one or two car parking spaces that you think, well, it's a public space, it shouldn't be used for a private vehicle, that vehicle space can be used 10 times more than a private car will use that space. And you'll get a lot of synergy there, which is more people using the vehicles, less people owning cars, more space gets freed up. It's a virtuous cycle. And so these are real opportunities where you can work together. Now, on the car share provider side, you got some work to do too. You don't get off scot-free. You have to do a lot more data work. You have to tell your stories a little bit better than you have been lately. You have to show compelling evidence that your system actually meets and gets to a lot of the goals that the cities really need to see. You need to help them tell the story. How do you become part of the solution to help them change and reallocate space on streets, to improve the quality of life, to create those better outcomes that cities so desperately say they need to do? How are you part of that voice? Can you help them with telling the story? Can you help them with data? Can you help them with, if you've got a really good graphics team, can you help them with these infographics? Kind of like the slides I've created. Like, you need to be a real partner with them, and sometimes educate them. They don't know all of the value that you have. So help them learn by providing webinars or different types of learning tools, just like this one we're doing today, so that they can see how is the benefit and the synergy. You're not just another private company they have to worry about. You're actually one of those opportunities where they can really work together and embrace these outcomes in a shared way. And telling those compelling stories, because this ultimately is going to be a political decision. It's not a technical issue. It's a political issue that needs some really good storytelling, and they need sound bites. So help them with that storytelling. So that's the nutshell of where we've been at, where we're heading. And we have to work together. We need government, community, and companies to work together to make it work. So this is our chance now to really think big, stop fearing so much, experiment some more, let's make stuff, and let's go big. So I really thank you for your time. Thanks so much.
Well,
over to you, Pam.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Rudy from Inverse, who is on standby here. Hold on.
It should be good.
There you go, Rudy. Thanks.
Wonderful. Wow, Tim, what an inspiring presentation and overview. Thank you so much. My name is Rudy Six. I'm the CEO with Inverse Mobility Solutions. And in a nutshell, we make mobility shareable since 1993 with now over 65,000 vehicles, e-scooters and e-kick scooters, those that Tim was showing there as well, equipped over the entire world. And as the pioneer of automated vehicle sharing, it's exciting to see the growth and development of shared mobility and to hear Tim talk about where the future of shared mobility is going. Even with all the new mobility options that have popped up over the last few years, we've seen that different modes need to coexist together to serve different trip purposes. We hope that everybody is just as motivated as we are to make shared mobility even bigger in the coming years. Thank you to CSA for hosting this webinar and giving us the opportunity to sponsor today's event, to Tim for sharing his vast experiences, and to everyone for attending and doing your part for moving shared mobility forward. It's been a really exciting ride in the industry over the past 25 years, and we're looking forward to the future. Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thank you, Rudy. And I'm sorry that we don't have enough time for a Q&A, a proper Q&A, because I promised that these would be only an hour long, and especially so you can share them with your colleagues and your politicians and your city officials. And so it's, it's a biteable size for people. I want to remind people that we're going to be having more webinar series. Go check out our mapping project on our website and look for our conference coming up in May 2020. And go onto our website, and if you think that there's enough value for you and you want to contribute to the growth of the Car Sharing Association and the work that we do, then please consider joining. And thank you for attending our first webinar. Thank you so much again, Tim.
You're welcome. Thank you.